The new Tears of the Kingdom trailer was nuts, and there's a pretty significant amount of it that I had to catch on rewatches because they threw so much at us so fast. But on a rewatch, I noticed something that made me pretty excited, and it's something you may have missed if you didn't go frame by frame through the trailer like a lot of us did. Although I'm sure if you've watched any trailer analysis video, you'll certainly have caught this as well. But during the first half of the trailer, in which it shows Ganondorf's forces doing their thing, as it pans past the giant bridge, you can see something pretty interesting. Standing on the bridge is what seems to be a gigantic three-headed dragon, like seriously big. It appears as though he completely blocks off crossing the bridge. He seems to be a legged dragon as opposed to the flying Chinese-style dragons from the first game, with a long barbed tail, and of course the three heads, which all seem to be aflame. Dragons are a pretty common occurrence in Legend of Zelda, and three-headed dragons specifically have appeared before. It is my personal opinion that there is a good chance the dragon on the bridge might be Gleeok. Gleeok, of course, is a reoccurring boss monster who first appeared in the very first game in the series, Legend of Zelda for the NES. In that game, he was stationary, though his heads would move around and try to bite Link or shoot fire at him. Link was able to fight back by stabbing Gleeok's head with his sword. Once he did enough damage to the head, it would break off and start floating around the room, shooting fire at Link while he continues to try and take the other heads down. Once all of the heads were severed, Gleeok would be defeated. Gleeok then takes a bit of a break before reappearing in Oracle of Seasons, in which the fight is fairly similar, except for he's no longer immobile, and once he's defeated, you then have to defeat his skeleton as well. He also looks a little different. A one-headed variation appears in Minish Cap, and then appears in Phantom Hourglass. His fight is quite a bit more intricate in this game, with one head shooting fire and the other head shooting ice, somewhat similar to Twinrova. Defeating him is a multi-step process, and it's honestly a pretty great boss fight. But other than that, we haven't seen Gleeok since then, and notably, he's never been in a 3D console game before, always just the 2D games or the pseudo 3D top-down handheld games. If I'm correct, and this three-headed dragon is indeed Gleeok, then not only would it be his glorious return to the franchise, but also his first time appearing in a 3D Zelda game. And I feel pretty confident that it is indeed Gleeok as opposed to a new three-headed dragon, because Breath of the Wild already has a couple instances of taking old monsters and reimagining them. The Hinox is a great example, being from Link's Awakening, but the best example is of course the Lynel, who first appeared in the NES Legend of Zelda just like Gleeok, and hasn't really appeared in many other games since, just like Gleeok. And he got a total reimagining into a much beloved enemy, hopefully just like Gleeok. So I do feel pretty hopeful that this is indeed Gleeok, who is one of my favorite bosses in the series. It makes me wonder how About's Link is meant to fight such a gigantic beast. I imagine that just like in all of his other encounters, the key will be to take each head out one by one, and I imagine you'll have a fair bit of freedom on how you go about doing that. I'm sure you could probably just snipe each head from afar, although ideally that would be quite arrow intensive. If you're standing mano a mano with him, I imagine there's a lot of different ways it could go. I like the idea that perhaps each head will be constantly pelting fireballs at Link to keep you on your toes, but occasionally one of the heads will lunge at you if you're close enough. Maybe if you dodge it, the head will get stuck in the ground, allowing you to wail on it while still needing to keep an eye out for the other heads. Or perhaps perfect dodging the bite will allow you to get some brutal counterattacks on it and might be enough for you to kill the head outright. From there, you would be able to focus on the other heads, but the ones that you destroyed would float around and shoot at you like a turret, just like in the first game. Once you destroy all of the heads, you can then attack the body and go for the killing blow. And of course, just like with the Hinox, I think there should be a Stalfos version of Gleeok. Maybe with the Stalfos version, instead of just floating around like the turret, severed heads will just fall to the ground, but then after a while they'll reanimate and rejoin the Gleeok's neck if you take too long to kill it, which would be a nice reference to his fight in Oracle of Seasons. I'm really excited to see if this monster is Gleeok, and if it is, how they reimagine him into a 3D game. It's pretty cool. But it also got me wondering, why not include the other NES bosses as overworld bosses for Tears of the Kingdom? It would be such a great way to pay homage to that old game. And to make things even better, even though all of the old NES bosses are fought inside dungeons, it just so happens that they're all pretty much perfect for serving the role of an overworld boss as well. The first boss you face in NES Legend of Zelda is Aquamentus, who is another dragon, another green dragon in fact. They definitely had a firm idea of what they thought a dragon should be in the first game. He's a tremendous tremendously straightforward fight. He mostly just goes back and forth and shoots a tri-splitting fireball at Link. But the idea of a dragon with a unicorn horn is pretty evocative, and I think they could very easily reimagine him into something very special for Tears of the Kingdom. In the same vein, they managed to change the Lionel from an enemy who just walks back and forth and occasionally shoots a sword beam at Link, turning them into one of the most engaging fights in the entire series. I imagine that Tears of the Kingdom's Aquamentus would still have a lot of his old traits, like the tri-splitting fire beam that would be difficult to dodge, but he would also be able to use that horn and charge Link down, preferably with really fast charge attacks. He could be the kind of enemy who keeps tremendous pressure on Link, just like the Lionels, and make it so if he messes up even once, he suffers for it. Again, Aquamentus has never made it into a 3D game, so it would be delightful to see him make the jump. I have this vivid image in my head of Aquamentus roaming the labyrinths to add a new challenge, being a wandering beast that Link always needs to worry about while he's trying to explore. This would also make it so the terrain worked in Aquamentus's favor, as the extremely narrow corridors would make it much harder for Link to dodge his charge attacks. I think Aquamentus is the perfect labyrinth monster, but honestly, I'd just be happy to see him anywhere in Tears of the Kingdom. The boss of the second dungeon in the NES Zelda is just a Dodongo, not even King Dodongo, just a single Dodongo who you can kill in about 15 seconds. I would love to see the Dodongos back, but this just doesn't really qualify as an overworld boss for me. King Dodongo would be cool though. The boss for Dungeon 3 is, of course, Manhandla, which is the funniest name of all time. Manhandla is really interesting in that he hasn't had a release in a mainline 3D Zelda game, just appearing in NES Zelda Oracle of Seasons and Four Swords. However, he has made an appearance in a 3D game related to Zelda, that being Hyrule Warriors. I think his boss fight in Hyrule Warriors is very good, and would translate fairly well to Tears of the Kingdom, with some obvious changes of course. A Manhandla fight in Tears of the Kingdom would be fairly similar to the Hinox in the sense that it isn't really about reflexes and doing intense battle with the monster. It's more about keeping yourself at a safe distance and landing precise shots to vulnerable areas, since only the heads of the Manhandla are vulnerable. It would also be fun if the new aerial combat could be integrated into the fight, in the sense that shooting a bomb arrow or dropping a bomb perfectly in the middle of him from above would instantly kill or severely damage him, in reference to his weakness to a well-placed bomb in his first appearance. In terms of environment, I actually think Manhandla could fit in anywhere. Its appearance could simply be changed to match whatever the local flower of the area is. In Gerudo Desert, perhaps he could take on properties of a cactus or something like that. I think it would be really fun to have a Manhandla in the game, as it would sort of be like having a fight with 4 bosses at once. I think it would be really great to have Manhandla in the game. When I say that, I sound like an orc from Warhammer.
Orcs is made for fighting!
The boss for Dungeon 4 is Gleeok, who we've already talked about, but the boss for Dungeon 5 is Digdogger. Out of every single monster in the entire Legend of Zelda franchise, Digdogger is probably the one done the most dirty, in terms of his artwork being significantly cooler than his in-game appearance. If you were to ask the average person what exactly Digdogger even is, I bet they wouldn't really know. He just kind of looks like a big orange ball that bounces off the walls in the room. If you play the flute, he splits into a bunch of smaller orange circles that continue to float around the room and can then be dispatched with your sword. I like Digdogger, but it's honestly kind of a bizarre and anticlimactic boss fight. Digdogger himself doesn't even really attack you. The threat comes from the beamos on the wall. Giant orange circles just don't strike much fear into my heart. But the truth is, he's supposed to be like a giant and menacing eyeball. Look at this artwork. It's creepy as hell. I honestly have no idea how that orange circle was even a little bit meant to represent him, but obviously that isn't something they would have a problem with in Tears of the Kingdom, where they can reimagine him closer to the original artwork. And it should be worth noting that Digdogger got another go around in Oracle of Seasons, which was a much more fun fight that utilized the magnet item, and his sprite is significantly creepier. Now, I do really hope we see Digdogger back, but I don't really want to see him directly translated to the game. I don't think a giant bumper car eyeball would be particularly threatening in a game with as much mobility as Tears of the Kingdom. I think that keeping the mechanic of him splitting into smaller versions is essential, but I think they have permission to rethink his moveset to go beyond sentient bumper car. What I would love for the Digdogger to do is actually not necessarily serve the immediate role of an overworld boss. The trailer has basically made it obvious at this point that Guardians really are gone for good, at least in the role of an enemy, and while the large Guardians are probably just being replaced by the new, stronger enemy types, as well as maybe the mini-bosses we're discussing today, Something still needs to replace the sentry guardians who flew in the air, and I think that something could be the Digdogger. I think he'd fulfill that role perfectly. I love the idea of many Digdoggers patrolling Ganon-controlled territories in the exact same way as the current flying guardians do, blasting Link with energy blasts when they detect him, and pursuing him if he runs away. I also think it would be really cool if being spotted by a mini Digdogger set off some sort of internal timer, maybe for a minute or so, after which more mini Digdoggers would join the fight. And if enough mini Digdoggers join the fight, they could morph into one large, full Digdogger who would be the equivalent of a mini-boss. I think the mini Digdoggers would be stuck to airborne combat, but once they transformed into the big Digdogger, they could be both airborne and on the ground, having large and frequent blast attacks in the air, and being able to live up to their bumper car reputation while on the ground. I think the mini Digdoggers would make a great replacement for the flying guardians, and it would also be a fun subversion on the traditional Digdogger, in which they start off small and then slowly coalesce into big Digdogger, instead of the reverse being true. I also think that thematically, a giant floating demonic eyeball fits the tone of Tears of the Kingdom extremely well, both from the perspective of the horrific apocalypse that seems to be occurring, as well as its new focus on aerial combat. If we take a look at Dungeon 6, we see the last unique boss in the original Legend of Zelda, because Dungeons 7 and 8 are just harder versions of previous bosses. But in Dungeon 6, we encounter the one NES boss to very much pierce the veil of inclusion in future Zelda games, and that is of course Gohma. Gohma is all over the place. 2D games and 3D games, TV shows and spin-offs. The rest of those bosses are lucky to be included in one other game, but Gohma is a bona fide Zelda boss celebrity. And I'm honestly surprised she didn't show up in Breath of the Wild to begin with, but in a way it's fortuitous she didn't, because now there's the perfect opportunity to include her. I don't know about you, but when I think about caves, dank, dark places underneath the earth, one of the first things I think about is creepy crawlies, and particularly spiders. Spiders are part and parcel of the underground, and I think it's almost certain that we will get some sort of spider-like enemy in the underground sections. I'd love for them to go a step further though, and have Gohma back in the game. She could be a unique sub-boss only found in the underground. I think we already have the perfect blueprint for how she could fight. It would be a mixture of Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess. Gohma herself would behave fairly closely to her Ocarina of Time counterpart, albeit preferably with a much broader array of attacks and dramatically increased level of ferocity. Gohma in Ocarina of Time was not just the first boss of that game, but she was the first 3D Zelda boss ever. So developers had to make her a bit on the easier side to account for people not just adjusting to a new Zelda game, but an entirely new dimension. Gohma and Tears of the Kingdom would have no such problem, so while I think the idea of Gohma rotating from the ground to the ceiling as per Ocarina of Time should be fundamental to how she fights, I also think that she should be shooting globs of poison at Link and trying to tangle him up in webs, leaping off the roof to sink her fangs into him. Where the Twilight Princess version of Gohma comes in is in terms of her spawn or her larva. The larvae in Ocarina of Time serve more as walking heart jars than they do pose any sort of threat, and while the Twilight Princess larvae aren't much more difficult, they are definitely a lot more interesting. So I think that Breath of the Wild Gohma should exhibit the behavior of utilizing the entire cave similar to Ocarina of Time, but her larvae should multiply and swarm like the larvae in Twilight Princess. I think a marriage of the two bosses would make for a unique and really great overworld boss, or should I say underworld boss, for Tears of the Kingdom. And that sort of covers all the NES bosses, not including Ganon himself obviously. At the end of the day, even if all we get is Gleeok, I still think that would be something pretty special, but I think they have such a great opportunity here to include all of the NES bosses and continue the glorification of the very first game that Breath of the Wild started. The Lionel is such a beautiful example of how a fairly straightforward and even boring enemy can be reimagined into something special. And even from just what we've seen, it seems as though Gleeok, if that is him, will be something special too. So why not do it for the other bosses? They all fit so perfectly into the overworld, and in Gohma's case the underworld of Tears of the Kingdom, and it would go a long ways towards filling the hole that Guardians were going to leave, as well as truly making it feel like a sequel in the sense that you'll be running into more than just Lionels and Hinox. If they choose not to adapt the NES bosses in this game, and I'm wrong, and it isn't even Gleeok, just another new three-headed dragon, that's not a big deal. I'd be disappointed for sure, but it wouldn't be any sort of detraction of the quality of the game. However, I do think it would be a huge missed opportunity. It's so perfect and right in front of them. I really hope they see it and go for it. Thanks for watching. If you like what you've seen, please consider supporting the channel. You can do so by leaving me a few kind words in the comments, give me a follow on Twitter, come join my Discord and chat with us, or sub to me on Patreon and join the Subrosian Parade. Regardless though, thanks for watching. That's probably the most helpful thing. Stay safe out there, and keep constant vigil as you wander the fields of Hyrule during this new apocalypse. You never know what's creeping above or below you, and it's dangerous to go alone.